So Washington State's 6 initiatives that were sponsored by Let's Go Washington and Brian Heywood have set national records, and the impact of their initial success is only just now starting to kind of ripple through our political establishment in the state. So let's discuss how the Washington State Democrats and the special interests who own them are in tactical retreat as they attempt to play defense here. Okay, so regular viewers know that I've been a big fan of the Let's Go Washington initiatives, all 6 of them, they were basically sponsored by Brian Heywood. And last year, these initiatives to the Washington State Legislature, they set national records for the largest successful signature drive in American history. 2.7 million signatures were gathered, which actually far exceeded the number of signatures that they needed to be approved for submission to the legislature. Now, this is also obviously a state record as well, with more initiatives that are currently proposed to the legislature, 6 of them, than has ever actually happened at the same time before in our state's history. Now, for those less familiar with the process, these are initiatives to the legislature, which means once the supporters have gathered enough signatures, and then each initiative has been formally certified by the Secretary of State, the legislature has a few options. And basically, the governor can essentially just do nothing about it. Now, if you don't understand this process, you have to go back to 1912 when the citizens of Washington State, after lobbying for almost 2 decades, they managed to force a change to the Washington State Constitution, which created this right of citizen initiative. And I'll link to this down below in the video description. However, to kind of sum up the way it works, the first stop for these initiatives is they go to the legislature. Now, the legislature can pass them as law, and then they become law immediately without the governor's signature or involvement. Governor Inslee basically just has to sit there, wave his hands in the air, complain, and then whine, and he really just can't do anything to stop it. The other, more common option, because after all, the reason why citizens are doing an initiative is because the legislature probably didn't listen to them, is that these initiatives are ignored or the legislature holds a hearing and votes no on these initiatives. In which case, Washington voters get to vote on them in November on the regular ballot, and they basically are at the very top of the ballot. It's actually the first thing that every voter sees above the president and all the other federal and state races. The politicians actually hate this, but this is how it works. Now, finally, there is more obscure options out there, but it's rarely used, where the legislature can craft their own version of the initiative, and then you will have basically 2 versions of the same initiative on the ballot. Now, that is good, and basically one that's good, and then one that is usually crappy, which the legislature would probably try to put in. It's really impossible for me to emphasize how shocked the Democrat Party leadership and the special interests who control them have actually been about this whole initiative event this year. They had plenty of examples in the past of citizens basically getting one initiative or one referendum on the ballot every few years. It hasn't happened for a while, but it happens. So usually their citizens are kind of trying to play defense. However, the political insiders were unprepared for this recent barrage of 6 initiatives all at one time. And this is why, in kind of typical temper tantrum mode, they have been just lashing out at Brian Heywood personally, because, of course, he's the guy who mostly funded this effort last year. And then the lefties, kind of the grifters and all of them, are just in a rage that anyone dare do this and then put them on political defense. Now, this surprise has been so shocking for so many in the political establishment because just 6 months ago, not one of them thought that this would actually happen. Even 4 months ago, very few of them believed that this would happen, even though Brian Heywood, the Let's Go Washington team, and Representative Jim Walsh, who drafted and wrote most of these initiatives originally, they were clearly discussing this issue for the past few years. I mean, it wasn't a secret. But back in 2022, they failed to get 11 initiatives on the ballot using an all-volunteer effort. Now, many of my viewers know I actually spent a lot of volunteer time back then trying to help that process. And it's apparent now that this very specific failure by Brian Heywood and his team to be successful in 2022 actually convinced the lefties and even most insiders in the Republican political establishment that trying the same thing again in 2023 would also be a failure. Now, I had multiple interviews with Brian Heywood in both years, 2022 and 2023, basically discussing these efforts. And you can view them again, linked down below in the video description. And I'm hoping to get another interview with Brian Heywood, hopefully in just the next few months, maybe weeks. So I'd like to do that so that we can actually get an update from him directly. Now, so back to the surprise by the success of the Let's Go Washington effort. Of course, with the tagline, let's fix what's broken. Now, this surprise was more dramatic because the lefties and the Democrats have, of course, sources on the Republican side of the political spectrum, and they use these sources to kind of keep track of what their political opposition's doing. And I don't blame them. I try to do the same thing with my sources inside the leftist camps. It's just basically how politics works. There's nothing earth-shattering or any big revelation in saying this. However, one defect the left has is that most of their sources are Republican political consultants or kind of traditional establishment types. These people were basically largely out of the loop on the Let's Go Washington Brian Heywood's effort. So most of these Dem sources inside the Republican world, they were telling their contacts on the left that it was a failure and that it would be a failure again, just like the 11 Initiative effort failed in 2022. Now, this is understandable, and it's not irrational. What they didn't realize was that Brian Heywood and his team of volunteers and others clearly used their failure in 2022 to reorganize and then restructure for success in 2023. It also clearly required more money, and most, not all, but most of that was actually provided by Brian Heywood, according to the PDC. That's the Public Disclosure Commission. They spent in total about $7.6 million to get 6 initiatives across the finish line. Now, that's way across the finish line based on the number of signatures that were verified at Secretary of State's office. And I'm going to point out that another reason this recent success surprised the left and the political establishment in general was because this didn't appear to be enough money to be successful on 6 simultaneous initiatives. You have to remember that in 2022, the left tried to get basically a drug legalization initiative approved, but they gave up after squandering over $5 million on just one initiative. And recent quotes by Republican consultants for just one initiative have ranged from $8 to $10 million. Again, just for one, with no guarantees that they would actually get the necessary number of signatures collected. So the insiders felt that failure was certain for Brian Heywood and the Let's Go Washington crew. Now, clearly, the Let's Go Washington folk were keeping their success quiet, and when they were broadcasting their successes, nobody really believed them or bothered to listen. All of this simply explains why the political insiders were surprised and why they're reacting the way they are today. So when it just suddenly dawned on the left and the Democratic Party establishment in Washington state that these crazy guys at Let's Go Washington might just pull it off and be successful, the lefties kind of panicked and they started a massive, mostly union-funded effort to stop the signature gathering. This was last year, and this included threatening the vendors, harassing and threatening the signature gatherers, getting elected officials to call 911 on signature gatherers, and even bribing signature gatherers with all expense-paid trips to Florida and checks up to $6,000 to stay down there until the signature drive was conveniently over. The left essentially wasted over $250,000 on these just failed and forlorn hope efforts in the fourth quarter last year alone. And every penny that they spent that was clearly wasted. Now, in December, when it seemed like every week the Let's Go Washington folk were holding another press conference at the Secretary of State's office in Tumwater, and the final successful submission was made in late December, there was a half-hearted and disjointed effort to flood the Secretary of State with observers from Planned Parenthood, SEIU, the Democratic Party, ACLU, and other tax grifter operations to kind of see if they could perhaps fight the validation process. Now, when that became unlikely to succeed, due largely just to the large volume of signatures that were submitted per initiative, over 100,000 extra for each one, then we kind of saw Governor Inslee freaking out and the Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins, bemoan and complain about the initiative process, even though just a few years ago she was praising it when it was for something that she liked. Now, this is basically when the controlled media started to wake up and start drafting their hit pieces on Brian Heywood. And this kind of general sense of anger, frustration, and shock set into the Democratic Party and the lefties who essentially control them. Now, why were they panicking? Now, this isn't hard to understand, and they are panicking right now because with 3 or 4 of these 6 initiatives, they basically shut down the cash flow to just a wide-ranging cash grifting and kickback scheme that the state always implements when they can extract new sources of the people's money. I mean, this isn't small either. All told, if every Let's Go Washington initiative becomes law, then the leftists and grifters, they lose about $2.3 billion per year of taxpayer cash from which they're already planning to profit at the expense of you and I and, of course, the rest of the state. Now, again, this panic isn't hard to understand. At just the most basic level, these political insiders and the tax kind of grifting lobby class that feeds from them, they've basically reaped a bonanza of extracted cash from the carbon tax scheme, the capital gains income tax scheme, and then the payroll tax scheme for supposed, of course, long-term, micro, short-term care. Now, each of these gravy trains of cash, they're being spent right now, right this minute, by the political insiders, and this money is used to pay their friends and their political allies and their donors so they can just get elected next time. The state didn't need this money. This was just bonus cash, and the political class extracted it from low-income and middle-income citizens to support the insider gravy train and their schemes that they support. Now, all that is clearly at risk now in November. And what complicates the drama even more, this is an election year now where every state legislator, every statewide office holder, half of the state senators, and many local elected officials, plus, of course, the congressional delegation and the president, they're all on the ballot in 2024. So these initiatives are very popular issues. And in particular, the Washington state voter, which historically, regardless of partisan affiliations, often voted to cut their taxes when given the chance to do so. So the Democrats and the special interests who control the Democrats, like their puppet masters most of the time, they just don't want Democrat political candidates fighting all 6 of these initiatives while simultaneously trying to convince the voters to vote for them. This is a very understandable and a very rational concern. So originally, with every single Democrat organization and every aligned grifting operation and bureaucracy in the entire state openly and vehemently opposed to all these initiatives, the Democrats appeared to be kind of circling the wagons and just ignoring all the initiatives that so rudely landed on their desks this legislative session. I mean, how dare the people send this to them? However, the pressure was growing. And their internal strategists, who are essentially running the numbers, they've essentially convinced them to initiate a tactical retreat now so that they can still have at least a fighting chance to keep their cash grifting operations running. So this is why the Democrat-controlled legislature is holding hearings this week. Probably by the time you see this video, they'll be done, but this is with a likely floor vote, I'm assuming, next week on 3 of the 6 initiatives. And the 3 are basically the Restore Police Pursuit Initiative, which is I-2113, which basically rolls back some just insanely stupid legislation that the Democrats thought was smart to pass just a few years ago, but which, of course, has just turned into this obvious crime wave disaster throughout our state. The other initiative is the Restore Parental Transparency, and this is I-2081, which restores parents as a primary stakeholder for their children and begins this process of transparency in both education and medical spaces, where Democrats and this weird special interests who control them, they've been kind of grinding away for over a decade now, trying to remove parental access to what strangers are doing to their kids when the parents weren't around. And of course, the final one is the No Income Tax Initiative, I-2111. This is Washington State doesn't have an income tax other than the recent kind of fictional support from the Washington State Supreme Court allowing the capital gains income tax. But this initiative, consistent with the 10 other times in Washington State history that the people basically of our state have rejected an income tax proposal, this initiative just further closes that door to this intrusive policy. So now here's the Democrats' theory right now, and there is some logic behind it. All 3 of these initiatives are very popular, and the Democrats just don't want to fight them in the November ballot. Doesn't look very fun for them. Plus, they know that they would lose the political fight anyway. So they're surrendering, and they're just hoping to undermine these concepts down the road someday in the future. So this is a tactical retreat on their part, and we shouldn't see it any other way. They may vote for them even, and all sources indicate that most of them will probably vote for these along with all the Republicans in the legislature when they have a floor vote. The Democrats just view this as a clearing the deck kind of for now and avoiding the losing fight on these issues that they'd become in November. Now this, by the way, is actually a huge deal. It's a big deal, and it's a far bigger deal than the controlled government-approved media will ever report. It is a far bigger deal than the Democrats will ever admit, and it is clearly a victory. 3 of them, actually, to be exact, for the citizens who gathered those signatures and who signed these initiatives, and for the Let's Go Washington crew who made this happen. Now, I hope they take some victory laps here because it is worth celebrating when you have a win. Our side rarely seems capable of recognizing victory when it comes, so it's worth celebrating when it actually happens. However, the fight is clearly far from over. The Democrats and special interests that control them, including the billionaires that fund most of their special interests in the state, they're gearing up for a massive media blitz and ad campaign this summer. and, of course, in the fall, attempting to convince a majority of Washingtonians to vote no on the remaining 3 initiatives. Now, this will be just a massive bonanza of cash for Democrat consultants and operatives, of course, as they kind of cash in on the panic and they get their piece of the billionaire pie to kind of keep their tax grifting gravy train going on the tax-funded operations that these extra tax increases clearly represent. Now, in particular, the initiative to repeal the massive bloated carbon tax scam, which is I-2117, is one big grift for the most corrupt in our state. There's no accountability. It's a secret tax on every tank of gas, increasing the average cost of gas by about 43 cents or so per gallon. Or, of course, the heating costs for people's homes, since it, of course, taxes natural gas, too. And this is just a basic old-school scam that simply escalates the cost of living just for the benefit of some tax grifters in our state to get fat checks for their pet projects and then recycled those successes and that cash as political donations. It is truly the most popular of all these initiatives, regardless of what the Democrats say, and the left will fight tooth and nail to defeat it if they can. But there's a problem here for the left. However, and this is really no small dilemma, originally it was spoken out loud in a Stranger article, actually. The Stranger's this hard leftist Seattle-based newspaper that essentially dictates public policy for Seattle Democrats. As they honestly pointed out late last year, the problem with funding the fight against these initiatives is that this is money that the left would rather spend to help get more crazed leftists into government, or at least kind of keep the crazies they have already in place. Now, these leftists have to divert probably somewhere near at least $30 million, it's a big campaign or more, into campaigns against these tax cuts. And the pro-tax crew still might lose the campaign regardless, and regardless of how much cash they squander. Because if the supporters of these initiatives are even able to run just an anemic campaign of support, the people are likely to vote for all 3. And they know it. Now, additionally, the left is concerned that these initiatives might drive voter turnout of the wrong voters, from their perspective, of course. These are people who might be just too apathetic to vote normally. You know the type. I mean, there's no difference. People who basically say there's no difference between the 2 loser parties. Republicans and Democrats are all the same. My vote doesn't count. Yeah, I hear it all the time, right? I'm too busy watching Netflix to take 5 minutes and complete my ballot. There's stories like this all the time. People like this might just decide, maybe just this time, to fill out their ballots, and maybe a few dozen from the homeless camps nearby at the same time voting against some of the grifter class who are essentially running for office at the same time. This is the other problem, of course, the Democrat strategists have is their voter turnout models right now are not as clear when it comes to tax-cutting initiatives like this. A much higher percentage of independents and Democrats, they actually tend to vote for tax cuts more than they can realize and more than it would be obvious. So we have decades of history proving this fact, and it's very hard to distinguish who these voters are amongst the Democrats. So this puts the Democrats into a box where the Dems might push their voter turnout models and then guarantee their loss on these tax-cutting initiatives at the same time. Now, none of this is certain or clear, and for the political insiders and the tax kind of grant grifting class, this is just horrible stuff for them. Sure, the consultants, they get fat stacks of cash to run expensive campaigns, so they love it kind of short term, but the real insiders could lose some of their scams, and they can't be certain that they win even if they just spend a massive amount of cash to try to defeat this effort. So in closing, for the thousands of you who signed to it, basically you signed in to support the 3 initiatives in the public hearing this week, thank you. For the hundreds of you who showed up for last week's rally, I was glad to see you there, and it was actually fun to celebrate knowing these 3 hearings were coming. For the hundreds of thousands of you who signed on to these initiatives last year to get us to this current situation in the first place, thank you. Finally, we all owe Brian Heywood and his team at Let's Go Washington a big thanks. And sure, I helped as a volunteer, just like hundreds of you. Many who watch the show, I know. But these guys at Let's Go Washington, they're the ones who kept it on track and got it to where we are today. It is sure to be an interesting year, and I'd far rather be in this position right now than just playing defense against the crazies one more time. So remember, if you want to make a difference, if you want to have an impact, if you want to do something that matters, you need to be willing to show up. Because, as I always say, in the end, the future only belongs to those who show up.